My name is Luke, and I'm generating this year's best and worst of. Hold on just one second. There we go. I love this time of year. You get to figure out what you liked, what you didn't like, what you want to invest your time in the future year. And I don't know, it's just a pause, a time for reflection. It's nice because, I don't know, introspection is important. And this is the perfect time of year to do it. So, let's get started. I didn't want to do a top 5, bottom 5 kind of list because I think that when you read a bunch of different genres, it's really tough to compare. And I don't think that it makes a lot of sense, nor do I think that it's particularly helpful to say that this is the one best book of the year. Last year, Barnes & Noble selected Lessons in Chemistry as the best book of 2022, and I haven't read it. I have it on the shelves. I'm excited to read it, but I wondered what it was that made this book better than any other book. It just didn't make any sense. It feels like genres are required so that you could say, this is the best book that I've read or that was released this year in this category, so that other readers who are interested in lists or recommendations could look at it and say, hey, I am interested in this kind of stuff. What is the best book of the year for this? And not be thrown by something else. Like if somebody wanted to read the best bio, what is the best recommendation for a biography or a memoir, and somebody said Lessons in Chemistry is the best book of the year, that's completely unhelpful. So with that in mind, I broke it up into genres. I have the best that I read this year, the runner-up that I read this year, sometimes the worst, usually, and then sometimes even the runner-up for the worst. And when I was going through my list of books that I read this year, I didn't want to say, well, I only read 4 books of this category, therefore by default, one of these books has to be the worst, even if they were all pretty decent books. Similarly, a runner-up for the worst. This feels unfair. So sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not. But I'll go through it and I will try to very briefly explain it because, I got like a whole page of this stuff. So let's start. Number 1 category is romance. I read a lot of romance this year, and the best romance that I read this year is Ever After Always by Chloe Leese. It's part of the Bergman Brothers or Sisters series. I'll just call it the Bergman series. And I love it. It's a book that's kind of a second chance romance with a marriage that's on the rocks. The characters in it are all adults and have adult concerns and issues. And it's just a really, really good book. A really mature kind of romance. And, to be honest with you, my least favorite romances of the year were the ones that felt childish, immature, stupid drama, really low stakes, people playing I've Got a Secret, just the middle school bullshit. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not here for it. And Chloe Leese's books have always been elevated beyond the first one. I wasn't a huge fan of the first one, and when I told my wife that Ever After Always was my favorite romance of the year, she was interested in reading it, and I said, yeah, but you gotta get through the first 2 before you can get to it. And the second one, honestly, is really good. It's just that first one that I wasn't a big fan of. It dealt with younger characters. I don't know. I just wasn't a huge fan of it. The runner-up is The Dead Romantics by Ashley Poston. This book shocked the hell out of me. I enjoyed so much of it. I thought that the characters were charming. I thought that the situation was unique and fun. I wondered how this was going to be resolved. This is about a woman who is falling in love with a ghost, and I wondered how how is this going to be resolved within the confines of the romance genre where the ending has to be, in order to qualify as a romance, happily ever after? Could you just go on loving a ghost for the rest of your life? Could a ghost stick around for the rest of your life? This is all very interesting to me, and I don't know, I had a really good time. I cried a couple of times. I laughed a couple of times. It's just a really, really good book. And Ashley Poston her writing is so cute. And I love it. I'm so excited to read all of her other books. Worst book of the year, Ashford Parker Doesn't Fail. I didn't like the drama. It was very weak and shallow. I thought that the characters were all too much. I thought that it was, I don't know, it wasn't a book. It wasn't a book for me. It definitely wasn't a book that was written for me. And, not every book needs to be written for me, but this felt like being chased out of a book, if that makes sense. I didn't have a good time. And I thought that the story itself was just so shallow and easily solved. All this drama is it's just so easily solved if you just talk about it, that even the author solved the problem of the drama within the first quarter of the book, and then she seemed to have forgotten it. And then we're just left with drama knowing the solution to the drama for the rest of the book. It was a real slog to get through, and I didn't like it. The runner-up is Meet Me in the Margins by Melissa Ferguson. And it was an interesting book. It was probably the most interesting read that I had this year, because I finished it and I thought, well, that was a decent book. It's an okay book. It's an okay romance. The characters were okay. But the more I thought about it, the more I was like, but I didn't like this, and I didn't like this. And then more and more of this started to fall into place until I realized that this isn't a romance at all. This isn't a romance book. This is a revenge story. It's all about a sister who used to have everything. She used to have a boyfriend that she loved. She used to be the cute one. She used to be successful. And then her little sister blossomed, became beautiful, grew into her own, became a success at work, started running charities. Eventually, the protagonist's boyfriend leaves the protagonist to date the protagonist's sister. And yeah, the sister should have probably been like, no, I'm not here for that. She didn't, though. And the protagonist is unable to secure her own living accommodation, so she has to live with her sister. The protagonist is unable to say, no, I don't want to participate in your charity where I have to work out. So every time the sister tries to encourage her to work out, it's taken as this hostile jab from the too perfect sister, and it's a lot, And by the end of the book, it feels like the universe is righted, at least to the protagonist. The boyfriend, who is now a fiance to the sister, says, he declares his love to the protagonist publicly, humiliating the sister, ruining a charity event. The protagonist obviously says no, because this is gross. And then the sister spirals, just completely spirals, drops everything, stops working, stops charity, eats everything, and asks the protagonist, her own sister, what's wrong with me? And the protagonist says, she just jumps off the top rope and lists every single thing she can think of that's wrong with her sister. And this is in the book. It says, like a kid going through a 5-minute shopping spree at a toy store. You're just grabbing everything. And then eventually she calmed down. And the message supposedly was, you just got to calm down. Just chill out, And that's fine for the protagonist. The protagonist was putting an awful lot of pressure on herself, but it is not okay to look at somebody else and say, you need to calm down because I am unsatisfied with how successful you are, how pretty you are, or how you somehow got my ex-boyfriend to fall in love with you. This is unfair of anyone to put that stuff on somebody else. I hated it. It was so irritating because the overall message wasn't you need to calm down, or at least that's not how I read it. It was you get down to my level. And that was all. As far as the romance goes, this protagonist fell in love with the idea of a person. She left a manuscript in a hidden room at the publishing house that she works at, and somebody had started to write in the margins. And then she responded to the margins. So there's like this very middle school back and forth in note form. And you gotta wonder, how friggin' big are these margins? Because some of the notes are quite substantial. What publishing house is currently using paper? And where is this romantic? Like, who falls in love with the idea of a person to the point where they are going to solidify it by the end of the story with happily ever after? It just doesn't make sense. Most of the book, she thinks that it's somebody that it's not. So this whole time, she thinks she's falling in love with somebody. Turns out that's not the guy. And she is kind of relieved because she had never considered that person sexually. And when you think about, like, what exactly are you falling in love with? How is this going to last? It's so friggin' weak. And I didn't like it. I didn't like it at all. Like, it was such a strange feeling to exit the book and say, yeah, that was a harmless, inoffensive book. But then upon reflection, have all this stuff just, and then you realize, wait a minute, I kind of hated that book. And this is the first time that that's ever happened to me. Usually when you read a book, you start to pick up pretty quick whether you like or don't like the book, and then everything else is just kind of solidifying that opinion or changing it. Very rarely do you walk away going like, meh. And then a day later go, actually, it might be one of the worst books I've ever read in my life. Like, this doesn't happen. So this book is very special to me in that regard. So, good job, Melissa Ferguson. Next genre, Stephen King. Now, I know that a lot of people wouldn't consider Stephen King its own genre, but, well, this is my channel. This is my video, and I read a lot of Stephen King. So, yeah, I'm going to roll with it. Deal with it. He's certainly got enough books to consider him a genre in and of himself. And the best Stephen King book that I read this year is Rose Madder. Stephen King said that this was his lowest selling book. And if you look at the market dictating what books are good or bad, then you would, be excused for thinking that lowest selling equals his worst book. But no. It was a really good book. I was shocked. It tells the story of a battered wife leaving her home. She has been conditioned by her husband very violently to be the way that she is, kind of a scared mouse situation. So she decides one day she's done. She's gonna leave, and she leaves, and it details her thought process and how to do it. Some mistakes were made along the way. Some things like I wouldn't do, but I have not been conditioned through years and years of domestic abuse, so it was still interesting to read. And there was a supernatural story attached to it as well. But even if the supernatural story wasn't there, it's still a really intriguing book. And it came out at a time when Stephen King was really leaning into the strength in heroines. And it's a really solid book that gets ignored all the time. And I think it gets ignored because of the weird covers that are constantly attached to it. The strange title, Rose Madder. Apparently it's a color. I didn't know that. I I don't know, I didn't know it. When I started reading Stephen King at the age of 13, 14, I just straight up ignored this book. I did not think that it would be anything to write home about, and I was pretty wrong. But I also don't think that 13 or 14-year-old me would have been able to appreciate the nuances of it. So I'm glad that adult me read it instead. It's a really good one. Runner-up for best is It. And I just want to pause here and let that sink in. It is the runner-up to Rose Madder. It is often in people's top fives, if not their number one Stephen King book. And I still put it behind Rose Madder. And the reason is that it's a really good book, but I thought that I just thought that there was more to Rose Madder. I think that it is a very good horror book. I think that it is a very good coming of age book. But I like the emotional depth of Rose Madder instead. The worst, because let me say that although I love Stephen King and I collect Stephen King books, I have some of his hardcovers over there. I have a collection of his Hodder and Stoughton Kingbow growing upstairs, and I fully plan on buying like mass market paperbacks when he inevitably dies to rebind to make into like this very cohesive looking collection. I am hardly a Stephen King bro, and I don't think that he's flawless. So, the worst Stephen King book I've read this year is Faithful, which is really interesting. I like baseball. I identified with the Boston Red Sox for a long time. I was wearing a Red Sox cap, and I was very supportive of the team. I have the front page from the day after they won their World Series. This book documents that season where they ended up winning the World Series and supposedly breaking a curse. And I like a lot of it. I like the enthusiasm that it has, but I didn't really like the construction. I thought that if there was ever a chance to novelize nonfiction, this is it. This is the perfect chance. But it's a lot of back and forth emails between Stuart Onan and Stephen King, and the jargon is deep. I like baseball. I couldn't understand a lot of the terms that were being thrown around, and it made me wonder if I was really a baseball fan. And it made me wonder if I really wanted to be a baseball fan, if it meant this kind of level of obsession. And I understand that you have to be obsessed for this kind of book to be pulled off. You know, you can't be a fair weather fan catching games as you can. You have to be dedicated to it in order to write a book about the entire season. And I get that, but this could have been more exciting. He could have tackled the 2004 season just like he did with the fictional story of Blockade Billy. It could have been Stephen King's take on a 1990s era Disney sports movie, but it wasn't. And overall, I thought that it was kind of boring and really difficult to follow. And when I think about people like Nicole Reed's King or other British people who read Stephen King and they say they are trying to read his entire catalog in publication order, I just kind of cringe at the idea that they are going to hit 2004 and read this, because this is going to be really tough. I like baseball, and I had a tough time with this book. A lot of Brits don't even know how baseball works, and I think they're going to have a really, really difficult time. The runner-up is Everything's Eventual. Everything's Eventual is actually one of his better short story collections. The problem is, I'm not a huge fan of Stephen King's short story collections. I think that Stephen King's strength lies in character and world development, and I'm not saying that they all need to be tomes like It or The Stand or Insomnia or Needful Things, but I do need a little bit more. And the other problem with short story collections is that there's always going to be some duds. And I remember reading this when it came out, and I had the same problem that I did reading it this time, is that it hit the Dark Tower short story, and it did not feel like a short story. I'm not the world's biggest fan of the Dark Tower series in general, and there are a lot of good short stories in here, some horror, some not horror, and then this long short story that ties into the Dark Tower series, which was a series that I had not read when I read the book, so it was even more uninteresting. But even as a person who's read the series, I could take or leave it. And really, I thought that this dragged the book down in general. There's a lot of really good stories in there. This is not one of them, and it was like a brick. Just taking it down. So, that's Stephen King. Next up is Memoir Bio. The best is Just One Problem by Brian Gewirtz. Brian Gewirtz wrote for WWE right around the time that WWE was starting to admit that they had writers and stories and plot lines, and it was incredibly interesting to read about his experiences in trying to develop characters and stories in this world. Wrestling is often written off. It's like homoerotic soap operas. But even if you were to say there's a homoerotic soap opera, just sweaty dudes running into each other, they still run into each other like every week, all the time. They tour the country, sometimes the world. They work all the time, and it's a very physical job. On top of the physicality that comes with wrestling, they have to develop these characters, they have to learn these lines, they have to say these things, they have to work, And this is just the wrestlers. There are writers that are forced to write under Vince McMahon, who will say right in front of the curtains, right before the wrestler exits to walk to the ring, I don't like that line, it needs to be changed, and the writer has to scramble with the wrestler and say, all right, how about you leave and you say this? This is an incredibly chaotic world to work in, and nobody gives it credit. Nobody gives wrestling the credit that it deserves. I'm not saying that it's highbrow or that it's Shakespeare, but the amount of effort that goes into it has to be recognized. This is like going to a play, right? Like, you can go to the worst play in the world and you still have to marvel at the fact that it was created and put on display by a team of people who had to come together and design the sets and memorize the lines and practice and rehearse, and at the end of the day you're witnessing this kind of magic that comes from these multiple parties coming together. It's amazing. And especially if it's there in front of you, like movies can have multiple takes and then it goes into the editing room and gets cut. Wrestling, you can't have multiple takes. Everything is filmed live in front of an audience. You can't have somebody perform a suplex and have somebody else, a director, say, oh, we didn't get it with the right camera, the angle was off, I didn't see like the wrestler's left arm to the extent that I wanted. Let's reset and shoot it again. That doesn't happen. And I think that ultimately people need to look at it, and if they don't like it, that's totally fine. But they do need to look at it and say, God damn, that's a lot of work. Because it is a lot of work. Not only do you have wrestlers, not only do you have the writers, not only do you have the staff, the Vince McMahons, the Shane McMahons, the Triple H's that go out with them to develop it on a higher level, you have crews that go to city after city after city to set up, to work the cameras, to work the lighting. It's amazing. And Brian Gewirtz was right there. Not in my favorite era of WWE. Like, if you ask a dude of my age who came up watching wrestling like I did, they're going to say that the Attitude Era was the best. But that doesn't mean that this book isn't interesting. And the fact that he's documenting his time, which was right after the Attitude Era, You can also have a good time enjoying the transition from the Attitude Era into what a lot of us would consider more modern wrestling. It's interesting. It's interesting, and it's a good book. The runner-up is Thanks for the Money by Joel McHale. My wife and I used to watch Joel McHale on The Soup every week. It was the way that we started the weekend. So there's a soft spot in my heart for Joel McHale in general. But this book was hilarious. In a world of celebrity memoirs, this very serious writing, this very take me serious attitude, he's out there writing satire about his own life. It's awesome. I loved it. A lot of it was funny. Very rarely have I read a memoir that included pictures of the person writing the memoir's parents having sex. But they were in here, and they were humorous. And yeah, I definitely recommend it. The worst bio is called Wizard of the Strings. It's about this guy named Roy Smack. And Roy Smack is one of the most influential musicians that's ever lived. He came up in the vaudeville era, and he played the tenor banjo, the Hawaiian guitar, the ukulele, and the harmonica. So like 4 instruments, and he was really good at it. And a lot of times he could play 2 at the same time because he would shove a harmonica inside his mouth and then play, and he would play both at the same time. Very skilled musician, and he was the highest paid solo act for a long time. He was the first person filmed with audio synchronization. He had a lot of records when it came to the first person to do this and the first person to do that. He was among the first people to have signature instruments. His importance cannot be understated. And it's the fact that his importance can't be understated that makes the fact that his identity or his recognizability has disappeared over the years. There have just been more famous people that have eclipsed him. He's an ukulele player, so a lot of people... He's an ukulele player that's from a bygone era, right? So in the UK, when you talk about ukulele players from a bygone era, they go right to George Formby. And they go, oh, yeah, but I know George Formby. George Formby is famous. George Formby is the best. He's the most complicated, yada, yada, yada. But Roy Smack wrote the book, literally wrote the book on how to play ukulele way before George Formby. And yet, not many people know his name. It's amazing, and it's tragic. But he's just kind of melted away. And it's a real bummer. The bigger bummer, I think, is that this is probably the best book that we're ever going to have about him. It's written by a student and a friend, and it was very much a love letter to the guy, about the guy, to the rest of the world. This is why this guy mattered to me, and why he should matter to you. But it is thin, and it is insubstantial. And I didn't like how some of the stories would be repeated because it's a very short book. Why are we repeating stories? A lot of detail gets missed or glazed over. Sometimes there are contradictions. There are really strange additions to it. And you would think that in a book it's 120, 130 pages long. You would think that in this book that feels a lot like a love letter, it would kind of stick to that theme. But Vincent Cortez decided to add this. He added these couple of stories toward the back. One about how Roy Smack would say that if you get married, you're going to be in the doghouse. So get used to eating dog food, because he knew a guy that literally ate dog food in front of his wife, as if this was going to show the wife something, as if this was going to make the wife reflect on her husband and say, I'm the bad one here. I have caused turmoil in this relationship. If I were this wife and my husband did something to get into the proverbial doghouse, and then he was to try to show me that I'm wrong by eating dog food, I would have known that I married an idiot as well as somebody that did something wrong. He also had this very distasteful story about the Three Stooges and how Roy Smeck was invited into their hotel room while they were on the road, and there were groupies, sisters, and some very distasteful things happened, and Roy Smeck just happened to be in the room. That is the extent of the damage and culpability. He was in the room. That is all. The Stooges did these, I don't know, acceptable at the time things to these poor women. It was consensual, in a way that like groupies will consent to all sorts of stuff, but still gross. And since Roy Smeck wasn't directly involved beyond being in the room, I gotta wonder why it's here in this book. Why are we talking about this? This is a man who is like on par with greats like Les Paul. Why are we talking about what the Stooges are doing next to him? It was so frustrating. And it's so short, but it felt like such a slug. It was such a boring book to get through, and it shouldn't have been boring. It shouldn't have. I was just craving somebody like Edmund Morris or Walter Isaacson to have a book about Roy Smeck. I mean, he's important, and he's going to disappear, and that's a shame. But the fact that this is the best source that we have for him is pretty close to the same level of shame. So, not a big fan of that one. Okay. Next up, self-development. I'm a big fan of self-development books. I think that one could never develop the self too much. And I'm happy to say that the best book that I've read this year when it comes to self-development is The Go-Giver Marriage. It's written by John David and Anna Gabriel Mann. Good book. I liked it. There are multiple levels of story in it to set examples for anybody that happens to be reading it. But my favorite thing is that you have to work on the self before you can work on the couple. But that marriages can grow and they can develop. But it takes a concerted effort. And you can't just let it happen. It won't work out. You can't be lazy per se. You have to put in the work. And I like that. I like that a lot. It's a really good book. It's also easily digestible. So even if you didn't read self-development books in general, this one's a pretty easy one to follow. It's not particularly long. It's easy to take the lessons and put them into your own life. And that's kind of what you want in a self-development book. The runner-up is Why Smart Teens Hurt by Eric Maisel. Great book. It's interesting to read it because I have teenagers and they're smart. And it's interesting to read this book that has so many of the tics that come with them, but also, unexpectedly, a lot of the same issues and stumbling blocks that I feel. And I'm an adult. And if this is the case, like, he doesn't just say, you might be a smart teen if you feel this. It's very much, all right, once you identify that this is a problem, that you feel this pain associated with this thing, this is a suggestion on how to move forward from it, how to develop strengths against it, how to recover from those hurts. And it's a very accepting book. He talks about how sometimes you feel locked geographically in a place that is unsupportive. You're in a town, in a state, in a family that has different values than yours, that doesn't seem to accept people like you for whatever reason that is. and he doesn't shy away from the politics about it, and he doesn't mince words. When you get old enough, when you are able to, you need to get out. You need to find a place that you can be yourself and thrive. And this is good. This is encouraging stuff. I like that he does it. I like that at no point does he say, it sucks, but family's family and blood is thicker than water, so suck it up, Buttercup. Stick around. Ugh, that would be horrible, to a teen that hurts, but also to anybody, It's a good book. I really liked it. The worst is How to Say No by Diogenes. I like philosophy. I had never heard of Diogenes before 2023. I was pretty excited. He seems like a very interesting person. He is the originator of the Cynic movement, which is not to be confused with a modern Cynic movement. Modern cynicism is closer to nihilism than anything else, where you think the world sucks and there's nothing I can do, bing, bang, boom, and then you just move on with your life. Cynicism is more like the world sucks, I will try to make it better, bing, bang, boom. But cynicism in the classical sense takes an awful lot of work, where nihilism doesn't. And I wanted to know more about that. And what I got instead were short stories about Diogenes, written by different authors, and then kind of funneled through filter after filter after filter until it came to this book. And it wasn't what I was after. No, I didn't like it. It could have been so much more. Moving on. Graphic novels. The best graphic novel was a Batman book called Damned. And it starts with a figure falling from a bridge in Gotham. And then Batman has to figure out this mystery. It's a very good detective book. It is non-canonical. It's got a lot of really interesting twists with Batman. He deals with Constantine in the book, Swamp Thing, the Dead Man. He works with a lot of different people. And there are some... This is not a graphic novel to share with kids. There's an attempted rape. And that's unpleasant to look at. Also, some of the material just feels more mature. It's just a more mature book. The thing that I love about it, though, is that the art is impeccable. It's amazing to look at this book. The amount of work and care that went into it, just so friggin' good. And there is this twist to the Batman origin story in this book, and I don't want to spoil it for you, but there's this twist that I think makes the character of Batman make so much more sense. It makes his vow to not kill anybody in more modern Batmans make a lot more sense. It's really good. Sometimes these non-canonical books pop up and they hit with such force that some things become canonical. In Alan Moore's The Killing Joke, the Joker shoots Barbara Gordon and it paralyzes her. This became canon, but The Killing Joke was never supposed to be canonical. It was this one shot. It was one and done. Also, it's the only Batman book that I think I've read where people seem to be confused by the pretty obvious ending. And if you haven't read The Killing Joke, it's super old, and you should. When you look at the last page, you should wonder, why are people confused about this? It's pretty clear what happened. And then just, do a Google search. There are all sorts of people that are very confused by the ending of it. With Damned, I was very confused by the ending of it as well, and I had to look it up. And it made a lot more sense once I had somebody explain it to me. But the twists that were in there, still really good. And I kind of hope that DC takes that and makes it canonical, expands on this story, because it's really, really good. And it was written and drawn by guys named Azareo and Bermejo. Very, very good. They do such good work. There's a Joker book and there is a Noel book written and drawn by these same people. And the Noel book is basically, how was it described to me? It's either A Christmas Carol or A Wonderful Life. One of those two, but in the Batman world. How fun is that going to be? I'm super stoked. Maybe next year. The runner-up is Spider's Shadow by Zorski, Ferry, and Hollingsworth. Spider Shadow it's just a what if. What if Peter Parker hadn't taken the black suit off? What if it had permeated deeper? And what it wound up being was just a story about addiction, flat out. And there are an awful lot of people that want to write Venom stories, and I think that they kind of miss the addiction angle. It becomes more of a power fantasy than recognizing this thing that is taking over. And I think that there's a thin line between this. Like, yes, the symbiote would amplify the natural feelings that you have, but the symbiote is never, ever described as something good. You could be the best person in the world and it would still poison you, just like drugs. So nobody leans into that. It's more like a Jekyll and Hyde kind of thing where Dr. Jekyll consciously takes this thing that will turn him into a monster in order to let the inner monster out, and it becomes this kind of like just kind of like a willful monster saying, I am relinquishing responsibility of myself. I am giving in to this thing. Whatever happens. It's the id. It's the complete release to the id. But nobody wants to talk about the rotting that happens. And Spider Shadow does. Also, it gets really violent in a Spider-Man story, and that is also kind of rare because when it comes to symbiote stories, they're always kind of tame. And it's not like you go out looking for violence, but you would think that if an alien symbiote were to take over Spider-Man and feed off of his feelings of injustice and inadequacy and the inability to protect the people around him, and then channel that anger and all of those negative feelings, it's not going to be a pretty sight. And it isn't a pretty sight because Spider-Man straight up kills people in this comic and punches the Kingpin through the face. That alone was pretty fun to look at, but I don't know. It was a surprisingly deep story, and I think that you don't get better than this. Like, as far as Peter Parker in the suit goes, this is it. This is the be all end all. Speaking of symbiotes, the worst graphic novel that I read this year was Maximum Carnage, which was mostly written by Tom DeFalco. It happened in the 90s. It was when Marvel was going through this big process where they had a ton of titles and they wanted to cross over into a lot of them. And the reason is pretty simple. It's because their comic book collectors are often completionists, and once they start getting a title, then they're going to want to continue to get that title. And in these days, in the 90s, Marvel was just blatantly going after comic collectors' money. Special covers, multiple editions, and these. Like, they really, really wanted your money. And they were less interested in telling solid stories. In this one, they just wanted to write a long story. And some of the people wanted Spider-Man to tackle darkness, And Tom DeFalco was very resistant to it, and he said the only reason that he went along with it in the end was because the end had to have him turn away from the darkness. Like, every writer of Spider-Man ever pushes Peter Parker right to the edge. And every writer goes, all right, and then he overcomes these dark feelings and whatnot, and we're left with the Spider-Man that we know and love. It feels very Final Girl-ish, where because you know that the punch is going to get pulled at the very end, it feels less substantial and less consequential, and you feel more okay with the amount of torture that this character is going to need to go through. Maximum Carnage was long. It was a slog. It was kind of boring. And I didn't like the 90s isms of it. Supposedly, Carnage and his team are murdering all these people, just slaughtering them with Carnage's like weapon body, you know? All sorts of sharp stuff. No blood in this comic. And these are criminals to the utmost. They are deemed insane, they are vulgar, and yet the worst thing that anyone says in this comic is like, I'll get you, you witch, or whatever. Like, come on. It's just, it's Bush. You know? It's Bush League. It's not, it doesn't hold up. The fact that this was like a major story that Marvel was kind of putting their eggs in this basket, now it feels very insubstantial and, I don't know, exploitative. Every character shows up. Why not? And sometimes they're good guys, and sometimes they're bad guys, and sometimes they were bad guys, but now they're good guys. It's a very big team-up affair, and at the end of it, I was just done. Not a fan. Runner-up, not a graphic novel, but, you know, it's a Batman book, and it's Fear itself. It was written by Michael Reeves and Stephen Elliott Altman, and Batman books are kind of tricky, right? Because this is supposed to be the world's greatest detective, so you kind of want to put a mystery in there, and the biggest mystery is how are these writers going to convince you that it is not the criminal that you know it is when you read the title? Just think, like if you have just a passing knowledge of Batman, right? All you've seen of Batman are the Christopher Nolan trilogy, right? Just these 3 movies. And if I were to say, here is a title of a book called Fear Itself, who do you think the villain is? It's the Scarecrow. It is obviously the Scarecrow. And the book has like the Scarecrow on the cover. So I guess the mystery when you're reading this is, how are we going to convince the reader that it's not the Scarecrow? The mystery is, how is the Scarecrow able to function to commit these atrocities? It has this, like, there's this kind of interesting subplot where an artist's contribution to the world, in this case, a novelist, where the contributor, the artist, has to be responsible for the art that they create. In this case, like if a writer wrote a book that triggered somebody's PTSD, that the writer might be responsible. But if you think about it for any period of time, you go, no. Like, no. It's a simple thing. No, a writer is not responsible for somebody reading their work and then getting triggered. That is not the responsibility of a writer, because if that were the responsibility of a writer, then no books would ever get written, because everybody feels different ways about different things. It's a stupid thing, but at the very surface of it, you go, huh. No. But there for that second, it was kind of interesting. It's just like this interesting thing to roll around in your mind. And then it comes out solid no. All signs point to no. And as a result, this book was, I don't know. It was just kind of boring. It was a very mid-level book. Not the worst, but definitely not the best. Moving away from comic books and superheroes, we go into fiction, just straight up fiction. And the best fiction that I read this year was The Book of Cold Cases by Simone St. James. The reason that it is in fiction is because The Book of Cold Cases is not scary, nor is it thrilling, but it is interesting. And it is a good fiction book. I really enjoyed it. Simone St. James, I'm a big fan of. I absolutely loved The Sundown Motel. 100%. Couldn't get enough of that book. And her name's going to pop up a couple times on this list. This book, it's strong, and I'm glad that I read it. Not her best, but certainly the best fiction that I've read this year. The runner-up is The Lust Lizard of Melancholy Cove, which is a story about an ancient beast coming to a small town on the West Coast, falling in love with a B-movie actress, and the vibe that the beast puts out kind of makes everybody down, but also horny. And it's an interesting book. At the same time, this psychiatrist decides to cut off all of her patients from the drugs that she had been prescribing. She had been doing very loose therapy. She just wanted the money. So patients would show up, she would talk to them long enough to figure out exactly what drug to prescribe, and then Bob's your uncle, there's your drugs. But something happens at the beginning of the book, and she decides she's going to cut everybody off, move to placebos. So that doesn't help. It's a really interesting book. Christopher Moore is one of my favorite authors. This is one of his early books, and I think that he only got stronger as he continued to write. So this isn't, by default, his strongest book, but it is still very interesting, and it's definitely got its high points. I like it. The worst fiction that I read this year was One Italian Summer by Rebecca Searle. Ugh, so bad. Such a bad book. The story goes that a woman's mother died, and she is adrift in her mourning and her grief. She has this very weird relationship with her mom where she thinks that she is very important to her mom because her mom is very important to her, and she thinks that this is reciprocal. She looks at her father as this side character. The real relationship here is mother and daughter, and the father happens to just be there. Similarly, her husband just happens to be there. So she dies, and before she had died, they had agreed that they were going to go to Italy for a vacation. Just the two of them. Just the two of them. No, no husbands. Why would they come? It's only Italy. And then the mom dies. So the daughter decides, you know what? She's going to go to Italy. And she goes, and boring hijinks ensue. It's very predictable, but the character, the protagonist, is just one of the least likable protagonists that I've experienced in a really long time. She is awful and needy and just the fucking worst, man. Ugh. And the thing that really bothered me is that she goes out on this vacation, and it's like she's not married. And she had been flirting with the idea of divorcing her husband before she left to Italy. Why? No real reason. The husband's being incredibly supportive, has always been incredibly supportive, has always loved his wife and has been there for her, is actively trying to help her through this mourning period. And she's just nah. Why have a husband if my mom is dead? Why indeed? And then by the end of the book, he shows up. By now she's gone through her stuff and is more okay with the world. He shows up. He flew from America to Italy. And he says, like, hey, I still love you. I want this to work. And she says, yeah, I do too, despite the fact that I had an affair, but she definitely doesn't tell him about it. Why would she? Oh, she's only married. Anyway, husband shows up. They decide they're going to work it out. And he goes like, wow, that was a super long trip. Wow, it is beautiful here in Italy. We should stay here for a little while. And she goes, nah, I'm done. We're going. Ugh. The worst. Just the worst character. Oh my God. Oh, just so selfish and conceited. And oh man, what a waste of friggin' time. But there are good things about this book. Rebecca Searle paints Italy very beautifully. You read it and you want to go. You can't help but want to go. It's so beautiful the way she describes it. But that's the only good thing about this book. This book was so friggin' bad that at the end of it, I was putting together my bookshelves and I saw that I have one of her books in 5 years. I haven't read it yet, but I thought that, hey, this sounds like a pretty interesting book. But I hated One Italian Summer so much that I just put it in the donate pile. I don't want to read another book by her. The absolute worst. Definitely in the running for just the worst book that I've read this year. Anyway, I feel like I'm getting hung up on the fact that One Italian Summer is just a hot garbage fire of a book that for some reason is still being advertised. I gotta move on. Or this whole video is gonna be about how much I hate that stupid book. We'll go to nonfiction, and we'll talk about good stuff. We'll talk about the best nonfiction book that I've read this year, which is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. It's super interesting. She's a biologist of the indigenous type, and she wrote just an amazing book. It talks about indigenous mythology and how it could be brought into the world realistically. Like the three sisters of corn and beans, and then there's one more, but you could plant these three plants together and they will grow and they will each take care of each other by either killing weeds or protecting the lower plants from the sun. It's all very interesting, but it talks a lot about indigenous life and how there's a lot of erasure that's going on and how she has had to live with it through her entire life, what her experiences have been, and it all ties back to nature, and it's just such a beautiful book. I feel like when I read it, I just felt like I had been waiting my whole life to read this book. And I don't think that there could be a better endorsement than that. Like, if you read this, it's written so well, and it's so beautiful, and it offers such a unique perspective to what else is out there. You just can't help but love it. And you can't help but wonder why it took until very recently to have this book, to have this kind of attitude and approach. It's just so good. Like, just go out and get it. I understand that it sounds dry, right? Braiding sweetgrass. And when you talk about biology and plants, it's easy to think like, oh man, that doesn't sound like my jam. But you should give it a chance because this is so great. Oh my God. Read this book. It's so good. The runner-up is Work Killing You by David Pawson, MD. And I've read a few books about late stage capitalism, burnout, depression, anxiety, all of the fun things that, people of today have to endure. And most of it comes from a pretty left-leaning stance. This has no stance. This is right in the middle. Posen never says that employees should get a free lunch ever. He is very much like, if you give people the chance to work, they will work. And because people naturally want to do well when they do work, they will do good stuff. Your job as an employer is to balance the amount of work that you demand and the amount of incentive that you give, the amount of protections and provisions that you give as an employer. And if you back off of the requirements, you will get more productivity. I mean, for a long time, we had a 6-day work week, right? And then, was it Henry Ford or Thomas Edison? One of those two schmucks. They decided to experiment and cut it down to a 5-day work week, and their productivity increased, did not decrease. And I find this very interesting. What I find more interesting is that they never said, okay, well, how about a 4-day work week? Maybe because that sounded just a little bit too extreme. Now you're flirting with, like, if you go much further, it's going to be half the week they have off. And we just can't have that. That sounds bad. At least that's what I think happened. But it's a real bummer. So this book is very much like, hey, employers, this is what you need to do to properly utilize your workforce. And I like that. I like that approach, right? Because he's not saying like you need to give them absolutely everything. And he's not talking to the workers and saying you should absolutely get everything. But he is saying that you should get taken care of by your employer, that there is a responsibility that comes to capitalism that is largely being ignored by higher ups in favor of the bottom line. And I think that this is a very responsible way of looking at it. It's a very responsible book for employers to read and try to implement. I don't think they will, but it's nice to dream. So, next up is thriller. And the best thriller book that I've read this year is The Broken Girls by Simone St. James. Oh boy, it's good. I don't think that it's like as good as The Sundown Motel, because I really, really love that book. But it is very good. Oh man, I don't know how to properly explain how good Simone St. James' writing is, but it is so good. She has a way of writing men in particular that has this air of ominous, of this lingering threat that you just don't get from anybody else. Like, you could read books about violent men toward women and you would still not get this vibe about it like you do with Simone St. James. Simone St. James is very, very good at putting you in the head of somebody that is vulnerable and therefore being able to feel the threat all more. It's super good. But the core story to this is also very interesting. It's like it's a murder mystery, but Simone St. James often plays around with times. You got something that happens long ago, and then you have modern day stuff, and this is no different. But it's still, it's just such an interesting book. It's very good. It's very good. You should check it out. The runner-up would be Killers of a Certain Age by Deanna Raybourn, and whoa, buddy. I had a good time with this. This was a fun book. It's a book about assassins, which is automatically going to be very interesting. And they are all women, and they are retiring. And I find the most novel part of this book to be the idea that anyone could retire as an assassin. This doesn't make sense. When I was a kid, watching movies, I remarked to my dad one day that it would be super cool to be like an art thief or a jewel thief or an assassin or a spy or anything like that, right? Because that's like flying first class, wearing disguises, being above the law, certainly being rich. All of this was very appealing to a young me. And his very first thing that he said was, they will kill you. In every job. Because you become a liability when it comes time for you to stop. You have all of this information. Why would they let you continue to live? And wow, talk about killing a dream. he did. So the idea that these women are going to retire like right away, you go, doubt it. And as you know, just like I called, somebody tries to assassinate the ladies, and then they retort, and it is very good. I liked reading more mature characters. I liked reading about assassins in general. I don't know. It was a really fun book. The worst thriller that I've read this year is The Shadow by James Patterson. And I can't help but do that because James Patterson has come out and said that he uses ghostwriters. Like he'll write up an outline and then he'll just kind of farm it out to somebody else to write. And then he will go through and make sure that it has his voice. Does that count as writing? You know? And I don't think that it does. And having read more James Pattersons than I would have originally thought, it's really shocking that he's as popular as he is because they're all kind of meh. Like, none of them are great. Why does he have so many fans? And it's got to be because he's in every single genre ever in such a great amount of numbers that people think he must be good. Why else would he occupy so much space on a bookshelf at a shop? That's got to be it. Anyway, The Shadow, for those that don't know, is an old radio show that they made a movie of in the 90s starring Alec Baldwin. I like the movie. It was made at a time when people wanted to make superhero movies, but nobody wanted to watch superhero movies. So The Shadow was out there with other movies like The Phantom, where they were plumbing the depths of old radio and old comics and making movies about it. But nobody wanted to watch it, you know, and it kind of makes sense because these weren't recognizable superheroes. But The Shadow is pretty good. Alec Baldwin, Tim Curry. It's a very good movie. What was it? Penelope Ann Miller was in it, I think. Pretty sure. She's always a treat. I don't know. It was a good movie, and I really enjoyed it. The Shadow is a superhero that can turn invisible and hypnotize people. And these are his powers. And that is it. So I went to work one day, and somebody had given one of my coworkers this book as recompense for a white elephant gone bad. He thought, I'll make it up to him and I'll give him this book. And I grabbed it from the coworker and I was like, The Shadow? First, James Patterson goes out there and wants to make us think that he writes books. And now he's going to take the same title as like one of my favorite superhero movies, certainly the most underrated superhero movie that I've ever enjoyed. And then I read the back and realized this is actually The Shadow. This is a story about the same character that I grew up watching over and over and over again in that one movie. And I was like, well, shit. Now I have to read it. So I did. And I hated it. Oh my God. The character of The Shadow and his partner / romantic interest, Margot, they get transported into the future, and he is starting to solve the mystery. He's trying to fix the horrible state that the future is in, and he does so with new powers. Yes, he can turn invisible, but they go out of their way to say that like only clothes that are super close to his body can also turn invisible, so he never had an overcoat like in the comic or in the movie. He never had 245s like in the movie or the comic. So as he is talking, he is kind of stripping away the superhero that we know, right? Like the character that we know is just eroding right before our eyes. And then he gives them different powers. Now, instead of just being able to turn invisible and be really good with hypnosis, now he can shoot fireballs. And now he can shapeshift, and not just into like similar sized things. He can shapeshift into being a cat. Why not? And it's at this point in the book that I was reading, and I go, why even bother with the Shadow IP? This doesn't make any sense. Why would you take an established character, strip him of the things that make him identifiable to us, and then give him powers that he never had? Why would you do this? At what point does this jump from published fan fiction to something new entirely? And why not just come out of the gate with a new hero name, with a similar story? It could have taken place in the 20s or the 30s. These unnamed characters could be brought into the future and had the exact same story, and the guy could have not been the Shadow, and it wouldn't have changed a single thing, not one iota. It could have been fine. It could have been just another James Patterson movie or book. So why attach the name The Shadow to it? I don't know. It drove me crazy. Absolutely drove me crazy. The runner-up is actually Ghost 19 by Simone St. James. And you might be shocked. I was shocked. But I think that when you reduce something, like when you're cooking and you do a reduction, there is definitely a point where it stops being desirable and becomes too much reduction. In this case, there's the same bones as in other stories. There's stuff that happens in the past, and there's stuff that's being solved in the present, although the present is a long time ago. But it's short. It's too short. There's not much to grab onto. The only thing that I really like about it was that the pacing of the house's grip. This story follows an actress that takes a break, moves into a house on like vacation, and she arrives, and on like her first day, she goes, I'm going to get some groceries. And she's walking to the front door, and she starts to feel sick, and there's this feeling of like dread and doom, and it just gets worse and worse the closer she gets to the door. And then she realizes that she can't leave the house. But then, over time, she realizes that she can't get near the kitchen, which is near the front door. And then she just like, the house just kind of starts closing in on her until she could basically just be in one room. And the pacing of that is pretty good. But the rest of the story was just, it was too short to grab onto in any meaningful way. And I think that Simone St. James just reduced too much. So it just wasn't that great. Moving on to horror, and this is the last category, I promise, because this video has been wicked long, and I apologize. Horror. Best horror. The Pram by Joe Hill. That is the best horror story I have read all year. And it's crazy to think that Everything's Eventful by his dad, Stephen King, was one of my least favorite, we'll call it a horror book, because I don't like short stories. And Simone St. James's Ghost 19 was on there as well because it was too short. But Joe Hill's The Pram is a short story, and it is great. It is the perfect length. It probably could have been longer, but it wouldn't have been longer in any meaningful way that would make you like the story any more than you already did. It came in, it did its business, and then it left. It couldn't have been more simple than that. It tells the story of a married couple who had suffered a miscarriage, and they move into a new house. There's a path between their house and where the general store is in Maine, OBS. And the first time he goes to this general store, pretty bougie general store, he gets too much to bring home on his own. So the owner of the store loans him a pram, and it is a beat up, old, disgusting pram. But it does the job. It hauls his groceries. Bing, bang, boom. But the husband just kind of becomes more and more attached to this pram and walking this path between the house or between his house and the general store, and he starts to see things, and he starts to hear things, and it really delves into the emotions that could come from a miscarriage. And I don't think that I've ever read anything that that better went into it, you know? Because a lot of times the father is going to launch into a protective mode of the mother. Like, yeah, the father lost a child, but the mother, like, physically lost the child. And, like, I mean, gender norms dictate that you got to take care of the mother, right? Like, you have to be the strong one. You have to be the rock. And he did. He was that. He didn't pay attention to his own depression and eventually his own feelings of resentment and anger. And these feelings grew and then manifested into the horror that is this story. And I thought that, I don't know, I just thought that it was, it's a horror story, but it tackles the feelings of a father who lost a child in a miscarriage so well that it was shocking. It's scary close how accurate it is. And it brought up the really good point that, like, nobody pays attention to the father when this kind of stuff happens, or very few people pay attention to the father. A lot of them pay attention to the mother, and that's right. That feels right, but it's not an exclusionary thing. I think that you could pay attention to the mother and the father, and a lot of times people just go with the mother, and it's kind of a bummer. And I know that there are stories out there, like, everybody says that they don't want to read about sad men, but this one hit. It was really good. The runner-up for best horror is Everything the Darkness Eats by Eric LaRocca. And I wanted to read Eric LaRocca because he's got really cool looking covers. Like, oh my god, look at these things. Also because reviewers would talk about Eric LaRocca's stuff, and you could tell that they had visceral reactions to the writing, and I was intrigued by that. So I read this, and it did remind me of, like, the splatterpunk era, the late 80s, where there was a lot of blood, and there was a lot of violence, and it had this unique spin on it from Eric LaRocca, where there's a good bit of racism in there, and there's a whole lot of homophobia. Like, oh my god, if dealing with the idea of hate crimes and homophobia is a personally triggering thing for you, I would not recommend reading this book. This book goes hard in the paint. It's crazy, but it's also written very beautifully. That's the weirdest thing about it. Like, I'm very intrigued to read more Eric LaRocca books. This is the first book of his that I've read, and I thought that the central story was weird. I thought that the stories surrounding it were hard to read. The homophobic stuff, you know, and reading it, I was like, I don't really want to read this. This makes me feel bad. But it's horror, and you kind of lose that after a while. Like, when you read Stephen King's or Grady Hendrix's or now Joe Hill's, you're dealing with more of I wouldn't say like a lighter horror, but certainly horror that kind of rarely makes you feel uncomfortable. You know, even Joe Hill's The Pram didn't make me feel uncomfortable. It made me feel sad, you know, not cringy. You know what I mean? Like, I wasn't shrinking away from it. I was definitely shrinking away from a lot of Eric LaRocca stuff. But at the same time, he writes so well and so beautifully. Like, his prose is top notch. that you can't help but read more, and you can't help but want to see how the story ends. And I think that a lot of his stuff feels very much like H.P. Lovecraft. I'm not the biggest expert on H.P. Lovecraft. I've read a few of his books. I'm a big fan of that kind of literary horror, especially cosmic horror. And I feel like Eric LaRocco's right there. I mean, the central story to this book feels like something that H.P. Lovecraft would have loved, you know? And he probably also would have loved the racist stuff, because H.P. Lovecraft was a horrible person. But it is what it is. And it was still a really interesting read that I liked. The worst horror that I've read this year? None. It's just been a really good year for horror as far as what I've been reading. It's really, really good stuff. And that is my list. That is 2023 all wrapped up. There were other books that were good, and there were other books that were bad. They're all eventually going to be put on my Instagram. I'm putting one book a day on there, and I think that 2023's books will be finished being put on my Instagram late January, I want to say. So if you want to find out more about them, or if you want to read deeper thoughts into them, by all means, follow me on Instagram. Or you can follow me here. Eventually there will be reviews here, and I will start to flesh out this channel more as part of my New Year's resolutions. But until then, I really hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for sticking with me to the end. And take care of yourselves out there. Goodbye.